So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue today on the lecture about fertility. And I don't know why my camera here is still not working. That's why it's all blank there. But again, I cannot see the chat. If you want to ask something, please just unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay. So, and the idea is that I will finish this portion here about fertility and start the chapter about mortality. The last portion here in this chapter, it's actually talking about a topic that's not really well explored so far in demography, which is male fertility. So male fertility is rarely examined in fertility studies. Usually surveys that ask fertility questions, they ask how many children, for example, women had in total in their lives, how many are still alive, how many died, how many they had in the previous year, how many live with them. But these questions usually I ask only to women, right? And there are several reasons for why there are not as many studies dealing with male fertility. The first reason is related to biological factors. There is a wider range of childbearing years for males. As we talked before here, the standard childbearing years for women that we use in demography is from 15 to 49 years of age. And for males, it can be much wider, from 15 to 79. So theoretically, there is no limitation on the number of children that males can have. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to understand patterns and levels of fertility. And also we would have, if we want to analyze cohort fertility of men, we would have to follow them throughout a much longer period of time than women, because they could have children technically up to around age 79. And related to what I just said before, there are some also methodological reasons. There's less data available for males than females in terms of vital registration. Not in developed countries such as the US, but in developing countries, some birth registration certificates don't have information on the father. There's no information about father's name, father's age, and so on. But that data is available for women. But not only in vital registrations, as I said before, even some surveys, they just ask the question to the mother of how many children she had throughout their life up to that point, how many children are alive, and how many children she had exactly last year. For example, those are some examples of questions. And those questions are even not asked to men because of biological factors that I said before, but also because of sociological reasons. Males are often regarded as breadwinners with little involvement in fertility except for impregnating women. And that's really clear in more traditional societies, right? Not in contemporary Western societies such as the US, such as also many countries in Latin America, and also all the countries now have been more open to women entering the labor market. So nowadays, start to make more sense, even for sociological reasons, to ask those questions to fathers as well. But so far, we usually don't have as much data, exactly because in prior years, since men did not have much involvement in raising children, they even would not know the answers about how many children they had, what the ages of their children, or when the children were born, or that kind of stuff. So I just gave you examples asking women how many children they had in total, how many are alive, how many, or if she had a child born in the last year. But also we can ask age of children or when they were born. You can be even more specific, ask questions exactly about pregnancy, about prenatal care that she got in each one of the pregnancies. And of course, those questions, men will not know how to answer so accurate as women themselves, okay? But there is a growing debate among demographers and public health researchers about the importance of male fertility. There is greater variance within males. So some men don't have children at all, and some men have many children. We also discussed in the previous portion of this chapter that also some women decide to don't have children at all throughout their lives. But this variance is much wider among men than among women. And I'm going to discuss each one of these topics in the following slides. Also, marriage is a clear determinant of fertility, and that importance of marriage on fertility vary by men and women. So that's important for us to understand those different patterns. And there are also different patterns of male fertility compared to women. And so that's why it makes it interesting to do more studies on these topics. So about the first one, greater variance within males. The greater variance contributed by the male sex. There is greater variance contributed by the male sex than the female sex to the next generation. We usually, when we calculate, for example, total fertility rate, let's say that a country in a specific year had a total fertility rate of 1.8 children per woman. Of course, that's an average. Some women are having more than 1.8 children, some women are having less. But overall, most women reproduce, and most of them are contributing at least a little bit to the next generation. I mean, of course, those that decide to don't have children at all, they will have 0 children, and they're not contributing to that total fertility rate. But overall, most women have children, most women reproduce. On the other hand, some males, pretty much, they don't have any children. And other males have large number of siblings, right? In more traditional societies in previous decades, some men would have children with several different partners. And then that shows what are the reasons that make some men don't have any children at all, and some men to have so many children. Would be interesting to analyze that. So that's one of the important points of analyzing male fertility, is to understand these different patterns. Why some don't have any at all, some of them have so many, compared to women who usually have more similar patterns among themselves. The second topic, marriage is a fertility determinant. Male fertility is likely to be influenced by marital status and by employment status. So married and employed men usually have higher number of children ever born. So men who get married have more stable family, and those who have a more stable job, they will tend to form a family and to have children. So that influence of being married and the influence of being employed is higher among men than among women, right? The third point, there are different patterns of male fertility. The age-specific fertility begin at a little later age among men compared to women. And then in the age-specific fertility stop at much later age among men than women. So we just said here before, women, the normal age range for childbearing is between 15 to 49, and among men is between 15 and 79. But usually it's a little later than 15, it's around 18 years of age. So it starts a little later, but then it goes much longer because of biological factors. And male total fertility rates are higher than female total fertility rates, especially in countries with male and female TFRs higher than 2.2 children per woman. So in countries in which we have information about total fertility rates for women, and those are above 2.2 children per woman on average, usually those countries, if we calculated, we would see that on average, men have even more children than women, exactly because they have children with different spouses, right? With different women. They are usually more traditional societies and so on. So it would be interesting to understand the different patterns, the pattern of timing, when you start, when you finish, and also the information about level of fertility, comparing the level of fertility of men and women. Cohabitation patterns, they also vary by sex. There is a higher tendency of women to cohabit than men. And this difference is more evident among women who previously lived alone, are foreign born, and lived in fragmented families. So women on average have higher chances, have higher percentage of those that are cohabiting than men. And among women who left their original household when they were raised and live by themselves, they will have even more chances to cohabit than other men in that same situation. Among men and women who are foreign born, they came from another country. Also, if you compare cohabitation patterns between them, women will have higher chances of cohabit. And also, women who live in fragmented families will be more likely to cohabit than men. So this is just to say that whenever we get out from that structural family pattern that we would think with the father, mother, married, and then children, whenever you have some kind of disruption, either by they being a little bit more independent and living by themselves, or being migrants, moving to another country, or living in a family that had some kind of issue and is fragmented, then cohabitation patterns will be higher among women than men. We have to remember that our society is becoming more equal in terms of opportunities for women and men, but it's still that the differentials that happen in our society are always usually against women that have lower socioeconomic status, even controlling for occupation, controlling for education, controlling for race, ethnicity. And also, when you control for specific life course events that happen in their lives, those events will also have an influence on some of their demographic behaviors. In this case, we are talking about cohabitation. There's different marriage and fertility patterns by sex. There are stronger negative effects of education attainment and fertility among women compared to men. Again, I just said, on average, if you compare men and women with the same education level, same race ethnicity group, same occupation, for example, and several other variables, men make more money on average than women exactly because of gender inequality that we have in our societies, including developed countries such as the US. And further on, we're talking here about earnings as the dependent variable. If we think about fertility as the dependent variable and education as the independent variable, for those people with lower levels of education, women will be more affected in terms of their fertility than men. And usually women with lower levels of education, they have lower access to technology, to contraception, to knowledge, and so on, and they will tend to have higher fertility. And that effect is much stronger among women than among men. Unemployment is related to men's postponement of marriage. So whenever a man, and that's something that I mentioned in the previous slide, doesn't have a stable life in terms of having a stable job, they would tend to postpone marriage with a higher degree than women. And there is also a stronger religion effect among women than men. So those people who are more religious, that specific factor will have a greater impact on women's fertility than on male fertility. So all these different patterns of marriage, fertility, employment, education, it's important for us to understand these patterns over time. It is important to understand these patterns between countries, but usually we don't analyze that as much because we don't have data for men, because historically we didn't collect it. But all these things that I'm discussing here show the importance of us collecting that kind of information. So more research is needed. It's much needed incorporation of gender studies into demography. Fertility and parenting involving both men and women start to be more acceptable, like in terms of men participating in the education of children. Still, women do more of household chores and take much more of the share of parenting rules in the households, but there is a greater involvement of men, and it would be interesting to analyze these changes over time. And we will just be able to analyze these changes over time if we start collecting that in a more regular basis. Okay? So here, it's the end of the chapter about fertility. And now I will start on the chapter about mortality. Good. So this next chapter about mortality, I'm subdividing it in all these different topics here. So give a brief introduction about mortality. And then I will talk a little bit about methodology. How do you estimate mortality indicators, right? So give you some overall measurements of mortality. And the major ways to measure mortality in a specific area, in a specific time, are these techniques called standardization and life table. Standardization is when you have information about death and population size by age group in different countries, but in order to compare mortality levels among these different countries, it's first necessary to control for the different age structure of these countries. Because countries, for example, like the US and Western Europe, that have higher proportion of people in older ages, we're going to see a higher number of deaths overall than countries that have younger population, developing countries. So in order to compare the mortality level of countries that have different age structure, some countries have more young people, some countries have more older people, we have to standardize those rates of mortality. Another way to take into account age structure is to estimate life tables. Life tables is the tool that we use to estimate life expectancy at birth. So that information about how many years on average people in a specific society are living comes from life tables. And these specific techniques here, I provide in the course website an Excel file for each one of them in order for you to understand exactly how the calculation is made. I will show everything in the slides, but then I will also show you on Excel. So in the course website, you can download this pretty much one compressed file, but when you unzip it, you're going to have different Excel files in which I explain standardization of mortality rates and life tables. And then after I talk about a little bit about methodology, give you a short history of mortality in the world, talk about trends of mortality and also causes of death, focus a little bit on the US, and then talk a little bit about infant mortality, which is an important topic whenever you're talking about mortality trends over time. This discussion here, it's included in the textbook, what we expect to be the future course of mortality. And I provide also some updated data about the coronavirus pandemic. If you download this presentation, this lecture in the course website, now I will actually update this topic here, the graphics that are on the coronavirus pandemic, probably on the day before that I will cover that topic, because we are still in the pandemic and I just want to give you the most updated information. And I will give you some sources that there are some discussions in terms of demographic discussions or effects that the pandemic will have in the future, right? As we talked before, in terms of fertility, I reminded you that, I kind of I don't think I made it really clear. So let me just go back there. It's something that I kind of want to make really clear for you guys here, since we just finished this. When we are talking about the approximate determinants of fertility, we remember that we have all these 11 intermediate variables that have a direct impact on fertility. And then John Bongartz, he suggested that these first four here are influence the most fertility: proportion married, contraception, induced abortion, and postpartum fecundability. If someone asks you, well, is the pandemic going to make people have more children or less children? Oh, because of all the social isolation, couples stay more together, so they would have more sex and then they would have more children. But if you look at the theoretical knowledge that we have so far, it's going to be the opposite. Because what did Bongartz say? These are the major factors influencing fertility. Proportion married. In a pandemic like that, if you have less interactions, you have less chances of people getting to know with each other, maybe meeting online, of course, and getting married. But even people who stay at home the whole time, you might actually see the opposite, an increase on divorce rates. An increase on divorce rates is exactly a decline on proportion of people getting married. So you might have actually a negative effect on fertility. Contraception, induced abortion. These patterns of use contraception and abortion is not going to change because of the pandemic. Postpartum fecundability, how often women tend to breastfeed their children. Maybe because of the pandemic, women are staying more time at home and they will actually prolong breastfeeding. And by prolonging breastfeeding, that will have a negative effect on fertility. So if we think about how the current pandemic might have effects on fertility, it might actually be a negative effect based on knowledge that we have from previous studies. Because we might have a decline in proportion of people marrying. Marriage is related to what? It's not just people being upset with each other, living in the same place and getting divorced, right? People get married also because they have good socioeconomic stability in their lives. They have good jobs and then they get married and have children. But what's the pandemic causing? The pandemic is also causing a huge decline on employment rates, right? And that decline in employment rates creates more insecurity economically to people, and they will tend to marry with lower chances. Contraception and abortion, these more cultural factors in our society, is not going to change. And maybe postpartum fecundability might increase even more because of the possibility of women breastfeeding more their children, and that will inhibit other pregnancies, right? So, but that's serious, like a society that experiences socioeconomic issues now, unemployment, that will affect negatively marriage and affect negatively fertility. So those things is important for us to understand and discuss based on previous knowledge that we have. I didn't remember to emphasize those points here of this framework for approximate determinants of fertility with the pandemic, but it's good for us to understand that these previous models, theories, frameworks that were used in the past to explain demographic components can be used now for us to understand what's going on now during the pandemic or for the future course, as I just discussed now, for fertility, and as we are starting now in the chapter about mortality. Okay? So the impact of mortality varies significantly according to social and demographic characteristics. Older people are more likely to die, so varies by age. Men are more likely to die than women, varies by sex. African Americans and Hispanic population usually tend to have higher mortality than other groups. Social class, poor people will tend to have higher mortality rates than rich people. Marital status, married people usually have lower mortality rates than other marital status groups. And area of residence, people in urban areas have more access to better food, to better health services, infrastructure, and they will have better, lower mortality rates than other groups. The levels of development, medical conditions, and a host of other factors influence life expectancy. And what is life expectancy? Remember, it's that single indicator in which I'm trying to measure how many years on average people are living in a specific country based on data that I have from a specific year. Which data? Mortality rates by age and sex, right? So all the levels of economic development, the medical conditions that people have access to, they all influence mortality. They all influence how many years we will live on average in our lives. There have been major changes of the historical record in the main causes of death. People used to die mainly of infectious and parasitic diseases. And today, the major causes of death in developed countries are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And major causes of death are different in countries with high and low levels of life expectancy. But with the current pandemic that we are living right now, what we see is actually an infectious disease is starting to kill a lot of people. Oh, but is it really important in terms of life expectancy? Just yesterday, I read in a study by a Brazilian demographer saying that by the rate of deaths that we have now because of the coronavirus, that might affect that we have so far, because in Brazil, the death rates are going up. The level that we have at this point, we expect the life expectancy to decrease by 3 years. So based on mortality that we have this during the pandemic now in 2020 and beginning of 2021, we might expect people to live, instead of 76 years on average in Brazil, it's going to be 73. And that's a huge drop because that makes the mortality in Brazil being more at the same level as some African countries, as some poor Asian countries, right? And Brazil technically is more like a not such a developing country anymore. So what is important for us to understand is that those fertility levels and trends that we discussed in the previous chapter, and also these overall patterns of mortality, we see all these patterns that in the past, these diseases were more important, infectious and parasitic. And nowadays, more diseases related to heart, cancer, and stroke are more important. But that might change or vary over time. And 2020 and 2021 are years that we have been experiencing that, in the specific case of mortality, right? And of course, countries that have different levels of mortality, they will have different causes. Usually countries that are developing countries that have lower life expectancy, they will have more diseases caused to infectious and parasitic causes compared to countries with a higher life expectancy. Okay? Now I'll talk a little bit about methodology, measurement of mortality. Quantification of mortality is central in demography, how we measure mortality. Measurement of mortality dates back from John Grant, who is someone who I mentioned to you here, living in the 1600s in England, and he published the Bills of Mortality, in which he tried to understand different patterns of mortality by age and sex, using registration records back from London. Mortality refers to the relative frequency of death in a population. And that's what we try to measure whenever I try to understand the levels and patterns of mortality. There are two major concepts of mortality. The lifespan is a numerical age limit of human life. What's the maximum number of years that someone with really good health could live? And the maximum recorded age at death that we have so far is from this French woman, Jeanne-Louise Calment, that she reached 122 years and 164 days of life. I just read some article recently kind of questioning if this record is correct, but for us to understand, lifespan is the maximum recorded age at death that we ever recorded in human societies. But what matters more for demographers and for public health researchers is life expectancy, which give us the average expected number of years of life to be lived by a particular population at a given time. We get the mortality rates by age groups, by sex, in a specific population, in a specific time point, and then we can calculate how many years we expect those people to live on average. That's life expectancy, okay? One simple measure that we already talked about it since the first lecture is the crude death rate. What is the crude death rate? You pretty much get the overall number of deaths that happen in a specific population in a specific year, divide by the overall size of that population at the middle of that specific year. Remember, the denominator here is an approximation of person years lived in a specific year. An approximation of that can be the population in the middle of the year. We multiply by 1,000 because that number would be really small, so it's easier for us to understand. So just to explain, to give some examples. In the US in 2013, we had a total of almost 2.6 million people dying. in the US in that year. And the overall population, the middle of 2013, was of around 316,500,000 people. Dividing one by the other, multiplied by 1,000, we get that the crude death rate in the US in 2013 was 8.2 deaths for every 1,000 people in the US in 2013. And the world range of crude death rate varies a lot. For example, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar have really low levels of crude death rates. And it also has really high, 21 per 1,000 people. And the problem when we try to compare these crude death rates here among different countries, that's not appropriate to compare them, because these countries have different age structures. United Arab Emirates and Qatar have a much bigger proportion of people in labor ages, in younger ages, and those people are less likely to die. In the US, you have more an older population compared to those countries, and they are more likely to die, right? So when the crude death rates are compared among countries, some of these differences are sometimes due to differences in age composition. So exactly in that comparison that I just made using the previous slide, CDR for the US 8.2, and for United Arab Emirates and Qatar equals to 1. Previous examples means that there are 8 times more deaths per 1,000 people in the US than in the UAE. So why is the crude death rate in the US 8 times higher than the UAE? The main reason is exactly because the United Arab Emirates is much younger in terms of age composition, in terms of average age, than in the US. Like I said before, those countries in the Middle East, they attract a lot of male workers to work in their oil companies, and those people are usually younger ages, up to 50s and 60s. So they are not at the ages in which they're really likely to die. And in the US, we have a more older population. And younger people, we have more younger people proportionally in UAE than in the US, have lower death rates. So that's why you see this 8 times higher chance of dying per 1,000 people in the US compared to the United Arab Emirates. So countries with large proportions of young people, of course, have small proportions of old people, and usually have lower CDRs because the young people have lower chances of dying. And countries with small proportions of young people, of course, tend to have large proportions of older people and usually have higher crude death rates because old people have higher chance of dying. So before you compare countries that have so different age structures, this one here, higher proportion of people in younger ages, this one here, higher proportion of people in older ages, we have to take into account this difference in age composition. And that's what the standardization and life table techniques try to do for us. So if age structure, even if we are trying to understand mortality levels, even within the same country, if that country has been experiencing age structure changes over time, the crude death rate should not be used to compare the death experience of that same population at different times, at different time points. So if you even compare here the US, you look at the crude death rate in the US from 1960 and the one from 2014. 9.5 per 1,000 deaths, 9.5 deaths per 1,000 people, 8.2 deaths per 1,000 people. So within these 55 years, from 1960 to 2014, there was not that much variation in the crude death rate in the US. You could say, oh, so the US is not improving health or mortality levels throughout these last 54 years. But that's because we are comparing different societies. We are comparing different populations in terms of age structure. The population of the US in 1960 proportionally was much younger. We had a higher percentage of younger people in the US in 1960 than in 2014. In 2014, we have a higher proportion of people in older ages than in 1960. And those people are more likely to die. So although we had improvements in mortality and health, that we don't see translated into a much lower crude death rate. The crude death rate is not capable of capturing the reduction in mortality when the population becomes older, when the population experiences changes in age structure. And the US became much older between 1960 and 2014. One single number that we could look at it is the median age. The median age in 1960 in the US was 29 years, and now in data from 2014 was 37 years. So there is a change in age structure. So that's why you cannot compare these two data here in a really in a straightforward way. You would have to take into account changes in age structure. And if you take into account changes in age structure, this number here would be lower, the 8.2. And I'm going to show an example of how to make this standardization of crude death rate. The crude death rate is a crude rate because its denominator comprises the entire population. We are not taking into account age groups. The problem is that the denominator, when it has all the entire population, we're kind of saying, oh, all this population denominator have similar risks of dying, but it's not true because population members are not equally at risk of experiencing death. Risk of death varies by age, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and several other factors. And usually when we do the analysis of life expectancy, when we try to estimate the average years of life that people live in a specific country, a specific year based on their mortality rates, we have that information broken down by age and usually also by sex, because the population has not the same risk of experiencing sex. It does vary by all these variables. As we also have been seeing in previous lectures, death rates vary a lot by age. And because they vary by age, usually we calculate the age-specific death rates. The same way that we calculate the age-specific fertility rates, we estimate the age-specific death rates. Demographers use age-specific death rates as a more precise way to measure mortality, because then you are looking, the denominator here, it's not all the population. The numerator here, it's not all the people dying in a specific year in a specific country. We are looking at deaths from ages X to X plus N, divided by the population of people from X to X plus N. So that's the age-specific mortality rate or age-specific death rate from X to X plus N. And that can be symbolized by ASDR or the capital N. N is the width of the age group. So if I'm talking about the age group from 15 to 19, the notation here would be M 15.5, D 15.5. If I'm talking about the 40 and 44, it would be M 45, D 45, and so on. The X, remember, is the initial year of the age group, and the N is the width of the age group. Oh yeah, the example here, the age-specific death rate for age group 15 to 19 is symbolized by M15.5. The 5 here is the width of the age group and includes 15. So that's the age group that goes from 15 to 19 years of age. Okay? And that's one example. After we calculate all the age-specific fertility rates for a series of age groups, and we plot them by the age groups, we have usually this pattern here. A pattern in which children below the age of 1 have higher levels of mortality. Once they reach 1 year of age, their chance of dying drop a lot, and then afterwards start to increase throughout their lives. And look at that. The age-specific fertility rates, we calculated for each groups of women. It was between 15 to 49. So we had only the 7 groups, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 groups. For mortality, we keep going into older ages, and we also keep going to younger ages. And notice here, for the first age group, we don't do from 0 to 4. We do it for people below 1 year of age and people from 1, or children from 1 to 4. Because these newborns, they are much more likely to die than children between 1 and 4. If we zoom in into this part of the graph, we still see this huge variation from 0 to 1 to 4, and then afterwards kind of stable and start to increase. Of course, there are different levels for different countries in different years, but this overall pattern of age-specific mortality rates has usually this shape here that we see for the US in 2007. Okay? And now, I think I have a slide that will talk about that. So I will just talk about that here. Just be sure. It's right there. If I have 2 countries, such as in the example that I showed to you before, like the US and the United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates has a much younger population, higher proportion of younger people than the US. They have lower crude death rates. If we compare the US with itself, from 1960 to 2014, because the American population become older, it's not correct to compare the crude death rate from 1960 to 2014. And because of that, we should not use the crude death rate to compare populations with different age structures. We should use the age-specific death rates that I just showed you in this previous graph. So the age-specific death rates and not the crude death rates should be used to compare the mortality experiences of countries with different age compositions, with different age structures. And standardization is a technique that we can use to take into account age composition when we compare death rates among different countries and among countries that have different age structures. We can compare crude death rates for different countries or years. We just need to adjust for differences in age structure. We estimate age-adjusted death rates and apply to a standard population. So in standardization, you get 2 populations. You use one as the standard, estimate the age-adjusted death rates, and then you estimate a new crude death rate that's standardized, and then you can compare them. I'm going to show you step by step how to do that. Oh, but wait, how did we do for fertility? We had the age-specific fertility rates that we simply multiply by the width of the age group, and we add them all to estimate how many women, how many children women are having on average. Why can we not do the same for this age-specific mortality rates? Because what did we do for the age-specific fertility rates? We just got, let's say that we have the age-specific fertility rates from 15 to 49. You added them all, multiply by 5, because 5 is the width of the age group, and then you say that's the average number of children that women would have if they were exposed to these fertility rates throughout their childbearing years. Why can you not do the same for mortality, which would take into account age composition? Why you simply don't add everything here and multiply by the width of each one of these age groups? In this case, since you have here just 1 year and here 4 and the other in 5, you have to multiply each one first and then add everything. Why can you not do that? Multiply each one of the age-specific mortality rates by the width of that specific age group and add them all. If I did that, what would I be saying? If I get out the population and expose them to these mortality rates throughout their lives, they would die on average 1.7 times, 2.3 times. And that doesn't make any sense, right? Because we die just once. So that kind of indicator, demographically speaking, would not make sense. We cannot simply add up all age-specific death rates and multiply by the width of the age interval because people die just once. This makes sense for age-specific fertility rates because women can have more than one child. So if we multiply the age-specific fertility rates by the width of the age group and add them all, we can have 2.1, 3.7, 4. But if we do the same thing for age-specific death rate, and we get, just to be similar to how we call here total fertility rate, you would have a total mortality rate. How would you calculate the total mortality rate? Get this age-specific death rate, multiply by the width of that specific age group, and add them all. You would say that, again, people die on average 1.7 times. That doesn't make any sense. That's why we have to come up with other measures. That's why I'm going to talk here to you about standardization and life tables, that they do take into account the age-specific death rates, but they estimate a measure that makes sense, demographically speaking, okay? So the first one, the standardization. We are going to do here an example of age standardization. Because we know that young populations, what are young populations? Those populations, those countries that have higher proportion of younger people, they tend to have lower crude death rates. And older populations with higher percentage of older people, tend to have higher crude death rates. So what do we do then? We estimate a variation of the crude death rate that allows us to account for age composition when comparing death rates among different countries. So we pretty much estimate a new crude death rate for one of the countries or for one of the years that we are trying to compare. And for that crude death rate, we use the age-specific death rates, specific for those age groups that we are talking about, and we multiply by the population in a specific age group, divide by the total population, and multiply by 1,000. So in this case here, I will just use I will just use this information here from another population. Let's say that I have mortality from Venezuela and from the US. Venezuela has a younger population. The US has an older population. So in order to compare the crude death rates of those, I have to do a standardization by age composition. So for example, I can get the age-specific death rates of the US and apply them into the population of Venezuela to estimate the crude death rate of the US standardized by the population of Venezuela. And I could do the opposite. I can get the age-specific death rates of Venezuela and apply that into the population of the US to get the crude death rate in Venezuela standardized by the US. So I'm going to show this step by step now. Let's see here, we have data on population size by age group and data on how many people died on each one of these age groups in the US in 2006. If we add all this population here, we add all these deaths here, if we divide number of deaths by population, what do we get? The crude death rate. And we usually multiply that by 1,000. So 2.5 million divided by almost 300 million multiplied by 1,000 equals 8.41. Right? So I just added everything, divided this by this, multiplied by 1,000, got 8.41. I'm going to go to the next slide before I go in detail about the table. For Venezuela, same year. We got the same information of population in Venezuela by age group and number of deaths experienced in each one of the age groups in Venezuela in 2006. If I get 102,000 deaths divided by 22.2 million people multiplied by 1,000, I have a crude death rate of 4.61. Oh, so Venezuela has better mortality pattern than the US. 4.6 compared to 8.4. No. We cannot compare crude death rates of countries with different age composition. So we have to take into account age composition. How do we take that into account? This column here, what is this? It's pretty much the proportion of people in each one of these age groups. How do you calculate that? I just got 4.1 million divided by 298 million, 16 million divided by 298. I do that for all these age groups. I get these proportions that they add up to 1 unit. If I wanted, I could multiply this by 100 to get the information in percentage terms. So this column here is pretty much saying that we have 1.39% of the population in the US in the age group of 0 to 4, 5.48% in 1 to 4, 1.39 from 0 to 1, 5.48 in 1 to 4. And moreover, I don't have only the overall number of deaths in population. I have it broken down by age group. So if I get this number of deaths divided by the population, that age group, I get the age-specific death rate. This number divided by this age-specific death rate in the age group from 1 to 4. Okay? So I get all these numbers here. But the sum of the age-specific death rates, as I mentioned to you, it doesn't make sense demographically speaking because we cannot die more than once. So we don't use the sum here. We have to do something else. But we calculated now the proportion of the population in the US in 2006 in each one of the groups, in each one of the age groups, and also the death rates in each one of the age groups. We can do the same for Venezuela because we have that data. We get 487,000 people divided by 22.2 million people, we get 0.0219, which means 2.19% of the people from 0 to 1. Get the people who died in that age group divided by the population in that age group, get the death rates for each one of the age groups, okay? So now we have enough data to use standardization and standardize these crude death rates before we compare mortality in the US and Venezuela. And just to explain why it's important to do that standardization, this table here, how did I construct this table? I just got this column here from the US, proportion of the population, multiplied by 100, so the information is in percentage terms. So 1.39%, 5.48 is exactly here, 1.39, 5.48. Getting one from Venezuela, 2.19, 8.0, put it here. And they add up to 100%. Right, this is up because of the decimal cases here. One way to show that the Venezuelan population is younger than the US population is to simply divide each one of these percentages by the other. 1.39% divided by 2.19 is 0.63. 548 divided by 8, 0.69. So this ratio here, I'm dividing the percentage distribution in the US by Venezuela. Whenever is above 1 unit, we have more people in the US proportionally in those groups. Whenever it's below 1 unit, we have more people proportionally in Venezuela in those groups. So this result here is pretty much showing that the US population is older than the population in Venezuela because the ratio is above 1 in older groups and below 1 in younger groups. So this is causing the crude death rate in the US being higher than the crude death rate in Venezuela if we don't standardize them. How do we show ways to show that the Venezuela has a younger age structure? I simply get this column here from the US, this column here from Venezuela, and put in a graph. And then I see the US here, lower proportions of people in younger ages compared to Venezuela, and higher proportions of people in older ages compared to Venezuela. Another way to show it is to have the ratio. From this, I just take this ratio here and plot it by itself in another graph. I get this ratio here, plot it here, and I have my reference line of 1. And this, I have to remember, I'm dividing US by Venezuela. So above 1, higher percentage in the US. Below 1, higher percentage in Venezuela. So more younger people proportionally in Venezuela, more older people proportionally in the US. So these two graphs is just for us to understand that the US has an older population compared to Venezuela. Or in other words, Venezuela has a younger population compared to the US. Because of that, we have to do standardization. And but when we look at the age-specific death rates, where are these from? If I go back to the original tables, age-specific death rate for Venezuela is here. Age-specific death rates for the US is here. If I get those two columns and plot them, this is the graph that I get. And what we see is that for all age groups, if we consider information for each one of the age groups separated, numerator and denominator just specifically for each one of these age groups, we see that the age-specific death rates are higher, always in Venezuela than in the US. Oh, here they look the same. In the Excel file, if you zoom in, if you just look at closer, you always see that the age-specific death rates are higher in Venezuela than in the US. Okay? So how do we standardize? Finally, how can you do that? You get the observed rates from one country and use the proportional distribution of the population from another country as the standard. So what does it mean here? Where these numbers here come from? The observed rates in Venezuela, 0.016. Just go back to those tables. 0.016, that's the age-specific death rate of Venezuela. And the second column is the standard, the proportional population of the standard country, in this case, the US, 0.0139. I just go back there. It's this number here, 0.0139. So I'm getting this column from the US, this column from Venezuela. So these are the observed rates. So these are the observed mortality rates for Venezuela by age group. And I will apply these mortality rates in Venezuela to the US population. And that's the result of this third column here. I'm just multiplying one by the other. These are the Venezuelan rates times the US proportional population. I get them all, add, and multiply by 1,000. I get 9.68. Oh, wait, 9.68. How were the results before? For the US, was 8.41 deaths per 1,000 people. In Venezuela, it was 4.61 deaths per 1,000 people. Now, what did we do? We got the Venezuela mortality and said, let's expose the US population, which is older, to the mortality from Venezuela. Then the crude death rates of Venezuela becomes much higher. This is the mortality of Venezuela using the US population as a standard. So the mortality in Venezuela is not lower than the US. It's actually higher, 9.6 deaths per 1,000 people compared to 8.41 deaths per 1,000 people when you control for age structure. And just remember, this calculation that I just did here now, observed rates of Venezuela, the proportion distribution of the population in the US as the standard, multiply them, sum them all, multiply by 1,000. Mortality rate, multiply by proportional population, sum, multiply by 1,000. Is exactly that formula that I showed at the beginning. The mortality rates for Venezuela multiplied by the proportional distribution of the US population, which is our standard, multiplied by 1,000. And when we multiply this, we add them all and then multiply by 1,000. So we have the mortality from Venezuela applied to an older population, which is the US, and multiply by 1,000. So we are pretty much trying to understand if the risks of dying in Venezuela were applied to an older population of the US, we would have higher risks of dying in Venezuela than in the US, which is this slide. This calculation that we did here, I just did this way which is the application of the formula 7.4 that is in the textbook. I just tried to follow the same idea of the textbook. That's the formula that I just went back to it and I showed in this slide. Another way to do the same exercise and get the same result of 9.68, maybe it's a little bit more intuitive to understand, is instead of multiplying the mortality rates of Venezuela by the proportion distribution of the US population, add and multiply by 1,000, do this other table here. What is this? It's the same observed rates for Venezuela. The same numbers here, it's also here. Here it just has 4 decimal cases, and here we have 3. It's the same thing. This number and this number. And let's just get the population of the US, the absolute number, 4.1 million. Just go back there to the table of the US, 4.1 million, 16.3 million. Go to the front again, 16.3 million. So let's just get the mortality rates from Venezuela and expose the US population to that mortality. If these 4.1 babies in the US were exposed to that mortality in Venezuela, how many people would have died? 67,000. If children from 1 to 4 were exposed to this mortality from Venezuela, how many people would have died? 10,000. We add them all, we get the overall number of people who would have died in the US if they were exposed to the mortality from Venezuela. So we are talking about mortality in Venezuela. How much is 2.8 million divided by 298 million times 1,000? 9.68, right? So we are pretty much saying that this is the crude death rate in Venezuela standardized by the US population. Okay, so that's what this gets into the same result that we did here before. The thing here, this step on slide 25, I follow exactly the formula that's in the textbook, but the step on slide 26 gets into the same result, but maybe in intuitive terms, it's a little easier to understand, okay? So now we can compare mortality of 2 countries with different age structure because we standardized the mortality in Venezuela by the US population. Cool? The life table slides here, you're gonna see that there's like a lot of slides. I will cover in the classroom the ones from 29 to 50. And I do use examples from the textbook, but a lot of the material that I'm using here is from another textbook, because I think it's easy for us to understand. But it slides from 52 to 71, I will not cover here. This is just extra reading that's not going to be covered in any quiz or exam. So I will just discuss 29 to 50. And these ones I will not talk in class. And then afterwards we go to trends of mortality in the world in the US. And if you go into the Excel file in the zipped file that's available in the mortality in our course website, and you unzip it, you're going to have these 2 files here related to standardization, and these 4 files here related to life table. The standardization, this one, standardization US Venezuela, is exactly the file that I used to do the calculation that I just showed you in these slides. This is the data for the US, population, proportion of population, death, age specific, Venezuela, those tables to compare the age structure, and then the application of the formula from the textbook and that other more intuitive way. And all the graphs that I showed are here. The age-specific death rates, and if we just zoom in, because here I said, oh, the age-specific death rates in Venezuela and the US look too similar here. But then if you look just the first age groups, you see that Venezuela is higher in all of them, right? If you look in the specific ones, you see higher mortality in Venezuela for all age groups. And this is the graph for the ratio of population and for proportion of people in each one of the age groups. And here are the calculations that I did for each one of those tables. So all the calculations here were done in this Excel table, and I just transferred them to the PowerPoint. But basically, what I needed were columns C, E, I, and K to do all this analysis. Okay? So thank you very much. The quiz is now open, and the quiz is going to be only about the fertility chapter, but about all the fertility chapter, not going to cover mortality because I knew that I was not going to finish it on time. And have a great weekend, and I see you guys on Tuesday. Thank you.